Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the remarkable, bloody and suspiciously poetic life of Ragnar Lothbrok. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You enter the world with all the historical precision of a foggy riddle. No birth certificate, no carved runestone, not even a good saga consensus. One moment you're a boy on a fjord, the next you're Ragnar Lothbrok, future terror of the Anglo-Saxon coast. Honestly, it's a lot to live up to for a child who still thinks moss is a snack. Your father might be a petty king, or just petty. Some say he ruled Sweden, others say Denmark, and a few suspiciously drunk poets claim he ruled absolutely nothing except his goats. Your mother? Possibly noble, possibly mythical, possibly just someone who told bedtime stories involving trolls and decided to raise one. You, little Ragnar, are already an inconvenience to historical clarity. Life in your early years is rustic, to say the least. Cold, damp huts, fish for breakfast, lunch and dinner. You learn to swing a wooden sword before you learn to read. Not that literacy is particularly encouraged. It's hard to write poetry when your hands are full of sheep entrails. By the time you're old enough to walk without falling in the snow, you've also learned not to ask too many questions. If a man with one eye and 12 scars says your destiny is to become a great warrior, you nod and say thank you. Even if he smells like spoiled herring and hasn't blinked since last winter. Your first real claim to fame comes from a fashion statement. You craft trousers from the hairy hide of a beast, maybe a bear, maybe just a very angry goat. Either way, the nickname sticks. Lothbrok, hairy breeches, not the swift, not the brave. Just pants. Still, you make it work. You wear them proudly. You wear them into battle. You wear them to dinner. People talk. You don't care. You're already halfway to becoming a legend, and the other half is just waiting for you to invent the concept of overcompensating. At night, you sit by the fire and listen to tales of Odin, Thor, and warriors, who ride into Valhalla on ships of flame. You stare into the embers, and something inside you knows. One day, they'll tell stories about you. You just hope they get your pants right. You don't remember your first boat ride, but your back still does. It probably started when your father, or your uncle, or a vaguely intoxicated neighbour with calloused hands and too much free time, shoved a child-sized oar into your palm and said, "Row, boy." No explanation, no encouragement. Just row, or be left behind. Vikings don't do floaties. The ship is a longship, but it feels longer when you're 5 years old and rowing next to men named Skull Splitter and Eric the Flatulent. You sit on a damp wooden bench for 12 hours, rowing to the beat of a man who bangs a drum like he's angry at rhythm itself. You develop blisters. Then those blisters develop their own blisters. Congratulations, you're now officially part of the crew. Meals at sea consist of dried fish, salt, and mild dysentery. You learn quickly that the sea doesn't care how heroic your future legend will be. It's cold, it's wet, and it smells like every Viking's undergarments. The good news? You get used to it. The bad news? You get used to it. Navigation is a mix of intuition, stars, and sheer Nordic stubbornness. If you sail west and hit something, it's either land or a whale. Either way, you raid it. Between bouts of rowing, you get your first taste of Viking campfire tales, drunken recollections of battles, beasts, and bizarre encounters with monks who can't fight and don't shave properly. You listen wide-eyed, wondering if you'll ever have your own story told in mead halls, ideally with fewer mentions of seasickness. You also learn a few key Viking rules. Never trust a Saxon with wine, always secure your helmet before jumping off the ship, and if the gods give you a good wind, don't ask why, just raid. By the time you're a teenager, your arms are stronger than most adult oxen, and your sense of direction is eerily accurate, even when mildly concussed. You've weathered your first storm, You've bailed water in a panic. You've thrown up on a chieftain's boots and somehow survived the experience. You are no longer just a boy with hairy pants. You are a Viking with boat legs, fish breath, and a steadily growing appetite for glory. And you're not even out of puberty yet. You've finally made it. You've rowed across freezing seas, eaten enough dried cod to qualify as partfish, and now, at long last, you see it. A monastery. Peaceful. Quiet. Absolutely crawling with unarmed, robe-wearing men who've never even seen an axe up close. You are about to become a very traumatic footnote in their illuminated manuscripts. You beach the longship at dawn, because if there's one thing you Vikings love more than gold, it's dramatic timing. The mist rolls in. Birds scatter. One monk drops his wooden spoon in slow motion. You charge, shouting something vaguely heroic. To be honest, it's mostly just noise. You're here for silver chalices, exotic food, and the sheer thrill of terrifying people who pray instead of fight. The monastery is defenseless. These men believe in peace, charity, and scriptural obedience, all useful qualities when tending to a vegetable garden, but not so helpful when a hairy man with a battle axe is kicking down your door. You find them clutching relics, shouting Latin, and, in one case, hiding behind a stack of dried fish. You are not impressed, but you are intrigued by their shiny goblets and bizarre haircuts. You ask one of them where the treasure is. He starts singing. You assume this is a war song and knock over a table for good measure. Gold is found, bread is taken, and one very confused monk ends up in your boat, not as a prisoner per se, but as a conversational piece. You've never met someone so terrified and so polite at the same time. You return home with your loot, your monk, and your reputation upgraded from that guy with the weird pants to the nightmare of Christendom. Bards start composing verses about your raid. They get most of the facts wrong, of course. Apparently you rode in on a wolf and fought off a dozen guards single-handedly. You don't correct them. Embellishment is part of the brand. Back home, you sip mead while your monk stares at a reindeer in existential horror. You've opened a door between two worlds, one of iron and frost, and the other of parchment and bells. You don't fall in love. You raid it. One minute you're pillaging a quiet coastal village. The next, you're awkwardly proposing marriage to a woman holding a spear and a grudge. Her name is Lagertha. She fights better than most of your crew and looks like she bathes more than once a month. You are smitten, or concussed, possibly both. Winning her over is complicated. She makes you prove your devotion by killing a bear and a hound with nothing but a stick, and the confidence of a man who lies professionally. You succeed, but just barely. She agrees to marry you, though it's unclear whether out of affection or curiosity about how long you'll survive. Married life is turbulent. She's a shield maiden. You're a part-time farmer, part-time nightmare of monks. Arguments are settled with axes. Affection is shown by not stabbing each other before breakfast. Romance is a duel that ends in heavy breathing and the smell of goat stew. Eventually, you do what all men in medieval sagas do when relationships get difficult. You leave. To be fair, Lagertha probably threatened to set your bed on fire, and you decided diplomacy was best handled from another country. Enter Thora, a noblewoman, beautiful, regal, mildly cursed. She's guarded by a serpent. No, not metaphorically. An actual giant snake. Local men try to win her hand and end up snake food. You, ever the romantic, take this as a challenge. You show up with those famous hairy breeches and a sharp spear, kill the serpent and collect both the girl and the nickname upgrade. Now you're Ragnar Snake in the Eye's dad. Sort of. Prophecies swirl like cold fog around your growing brood. One of your sons will rule the world. Another will kill a dragon, maybe. Or a bishop. It's very unclear. Medieval prophecies don't come with footnotes. Between marriages, prophecies, and more children than you can name before the mead wears off, your personal life starts looking suspiciously like a myth in progress. You're not sure if you're building a family or founding a dynasty. But either way, there's a lot of yelling, a lot of destiny, and at least one vision involving a tree bleeding from its trunk. You don't ask. You just nod solemnly, like a man who's either wise or very, very tired. There's no inauguration, no crown, no dramatic music. You become king the traditional Viking way, by being slightly less killable than everyone else. One minute you're standing on a pile of loot, the next, people are calling you King Ragnar, mostly because you've got more boats than they do, and you haven't died in a while. It's not a formal title. Viking politics run somewhere between Game of Thrones and a schoolyard brawl. Being king mostly means you owe more favours, and everyone expects you to pay for the mead at feasts. But hey, you get the big chair at dinner and people listen when you shout, so you pretend it's worth it. Your domain. Technically, Denmark. Realistically, whatever part of the coastline you've recently not burned to the ground. The concept of borders is still developing, and your map is just a damp piece of leather with angry notes scribbled in charcoal. To maintain power, you do what all wise kings do. Raid frequently, tell inspiring stories, and don't let the nobles drink too close to the weapons rack. You also fake your own death. Twice. The first time is strategic. A clever ruse to infiltrate Paris by pretending to be dead, complete with fake funeral and confused priests. The second time is less strategic. You just kind of disappear for a bit after a particularly awkward feast, where you accidentally insulted 3 earls, 2 sons, and 1 goat. People say Ragnar's dead. Then you show up in a boat like nothing happened. This becomes a pattern. Eventually, even you lose track of whether you're technically ruling, raiding, exiled, or retired. Power in Viking society is like juggling flaming axes. Flashy, chaotic, and only mildly fatal if you're good at it. You hold court in a smoky hall full of warriors, drunks, poets, and that one guy who keeps challenging everyone to arm wrestle during meals. Laws are passed by shouting, disputes are settled by duels, and marriage proposals, often indistinguishable from hostage negotiations. Still, you feel something stirring, a sense that this messy, chaotic kingdom of yours is part of something bigger, that your saga is only just beginning, or maybe it's just the fermented herring acting up again. You don't plan to terrify an entire continent with vibes alone, it just sort of happens. You wanted Paris. It's got walls, riches, wine that doesn't taste like regret, and the added bonus of being French, which means very few people there have ever encountered someone wearing a wolf pelt and screaming about Odin before breakfast. Your strategy? Confuse them into submission. You arrive with a fleet so large it causes a theological crisis. The Franks take one look at your sails and start baptizing each other in batches, just to be safe. Local bishops draft emergency prayers. Nobles flee to towers. One guy reportedly faints at the idea of your beard, but you're not just here to burn things. No, you're here to perform. You start small, impromptu screaming matches in front of the city walls, sword dancing on boats, animal skulls tied to the prow for that we may be possessed aesthetic. You even chuck a few decapitated heads over the battlements, not for tactical reasons, but because you think the Franks need some excitement. Then comes your pièce de résistance, faking your own death. You lie down in your longship, arms crossed, face solemn. Your men start wailing like you've been taken by Valhalla itself. They ask to bury you in the Christian cathedral, as a show of respect, obviously. The Franks, caught between superstition and peer pressure, agree, and so they open the gates. You rise from your coffin mid-ceremony like a hungover ghoul with tax questions. The crowd screams. The bishop drops his Bible. And before anyone can process what's happening, you've raided the cathedral, looted the treasury, and possibly converted a few onlookers through sheer trauma. It's not war, it's theatre. You leave Paris not just as a conqueror, but as a legend, a ghost story, a cautionary tale mothers whisper to their children. Clean your room, or Ragnar will sail up the Seine and scream at your house. Back in the north, your people are impressed. You didn't just win, you psychologically scarred a kingdom. You've invented a new kind of warfare, confusing your enemies so thoroughly they forget how doors work. You're not just a Viking now, you're a myth in progress. At some point, You realize raiding coastal monasteries is child's play. You're Ragnar Lothbrok, semi-king, snake fighter, beard model, and you're bored. So you turn your gaze toward Paris, not for strategic reasons, not even for the loot. Okay, partly for the loot. Mostly because Paris is big, shiny and French, and you want to see what happens when you poke it really hard. You gather a fleet of hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, and zero plans. Strategic meetings are held by grunting at maps and arguing about where to set the bonfires. Your sons come along, of course. Bjorn is eager. Ivar is suspiciously enthusiastic about siege tactics for a toddler. You sail up the Seine like it's your personal driveway. The Parisians panic, bells ring, priests scream. The nobles discover what happens when you build your city around wine, bread, and zero defences against madmen in fur capes. Your first assault is classic Viking, yelling, axes, and flinging flaming things at walls. Paris, however, turns out to be slightly more fortified than your average coastal monastery. So you adapt, which means you shout louder and invent siege towers that mostly just fall over. Innovation is hard. As the siege drags on, you get creative. You blockade. You taunt. You send messages by attaching notes to arrows, usually something like, "Hi, we're still here." Your men start feasting on swan and questionable eels. Morale remains high thanks to storytelling, drinking, and the occasional indoor screaming match. Eventually, the Franks offer money. A lot of money. The kind of ransom that makes even the gods raise an eyebrow. You pretend to consider it, mostly to look regal. Then you take the gold and leave, as planned, after a theatrical display involving your deathbed, a surprise resurrection, and a bishop wetting himself. Was the siege a strategic masterpiece? No. Did you gain territory? Also no. But you walked into the heart of the Carolingian Empire, banged on the door, and walked out richer than a dragon in retirement. The message is clear. Ragnar goes where Ragnar pleases, and Paris now sleeps with one eye open. You've raided abbeys, burned towns, survived snake pits, and fathered enough children to start your own war-themed reality show. But nothing prepares you for French food. It starts after the siege of Paris, when the Franks, desperate to stop you from stealing everything not nailed down, and a few things that are, offer you tribute. Gold, relics, and a royal feast meant to honour you. You agree, mostly out of curiosity and a dangerous level of overconfidence. The table is set. There are no roasted boars, no blood sausages, no mead horns overflowing with glory. Instead, you're greeted by pâté. It's described as delicately seasoned meat paste. It tastes like someone whispered chicken over a bowl of mud. The texture reminds you of things you'd usually scrape off your boots after a rainy battle. Next up, snails. You assume they're a joke. Your warriors wait for you to laugh. But no, they're cooked snails, with herbs, on purpose. Apparently, this is considered a delicacy. You try one out of politeness. It slides down your throat like guilt. You move on, hopeful. A dish arrives smelling vaguely like cheese and punishment. It's a soft, ripened wheel, aged in a monk's basement, likely next to the skeleton of whoever first dared to eat it. The flavour is best described as violent. You ask for ale. They give you wine. Thin, sour, red as battlefield mud. Your warriors try to enjoy it, but end up inventing entirely new curse words instead. One man cries, "The bread is good," until you realise it has raisins. You contemplate burning the table. Meanwhile, your hosts smile proudly, assuming they're showing you civilization. You consider responding with a polite beheading, but opt for nodding and chewing very slowly, as if this is how northern gods experience flavour. Later that night, you and your men retreat to the safety of your longships and cook something more familiar, namely, meat. Unseasoned, charred, reliable. You all agree never to speak of the snail incident again. You came for conquest. You leave with heartburn. In the sagas, they'll sing of your raids, your battles, your cunning. But they'll never know the true terror you faced that day. Frankish fine dining. You've conquered lands, outwitted kings, and terrified entire priesthoods. But you've also made the classic Viking mistake of reproducing enthusiastically and without restraint. You have so many sons, you start forgetting which ones are from which wife. There's Bjorn Ironside. Solid, dependable, strong jawline, possibly allergic to shirts. Then there's Ivar the Boneless, who walks like a riddle and talks like a prophet with anger issues. And don't forget Sigurd's snake in the eye, who, as the name suggests, has a weird eye and makes everyone uncomfortable at dinner. And that's just the named ones. You try to be a good father, or at least a present one, which in Viking terms means you teach them to kill efficiently, row in sync, and never trust the English. You tell them tales of glory and gods, of how you fought sea serpents, wore bear pelts, and maybe faked your death once or twice. The trouble is your sons actually listen. Bjorn sails off to become a legend in the Mediterranean. Ivar starts plotting empire-wide domination before puberty. Witzer can't decide if he wants to be a poet or a war criminal. Ubbe just wants everyone to get along, which is adorable. The real problem? You've given birth to a dynasty of Type A berserkers. Every mead hall gathering turns into a strategic council. Every family feast is an argument about who deserves what kingdom. You once tried to hold a father-son bonding raid and ended up refereeing 3 separate duels before breakfast. At one point you seriously consider faking your death again, this time just to get a nap. As you grow older, you realise your legend is safe. Not because of your deeds, but because your sons are walking, sword-wielding marketing campaigns for the saga of Ragnar. You've fathered not just children, but plot lines. Bloodlines destined to war, rule, and occasionally stab each other for sport. Viking legacy, it turns out, is mostly managing generational trauma with axes. Still, deep down, you're proud. Sure, they might burn half of Europe and disagree on literally everything. But they're your little warlords. And someday, they'll shout your name across the seas, even if they can't agree on how to pronounce it. One morning, after yet another dream where Odin gives you vague advice and a crow insults your beard, you wake up, tired. Not battle-tired, not seasick or hungover, although also that. Just existentially tired. You sit by the fire, sharpening a blade that no longer needs sharpening, and for the first time in your chaotic, snake-dodging, bishop-mocking life, you think about legacy. You wonder, did I change the world, or just stab it creatively? Sure, you raided kingdoms, stormed Paris, and turned coastal monasteries into Viking ATMs. But what sticks? Will the Skalds remember your victories, or just your more flamboyant failures, like that one time you tried to fake your death in a haycart and sneezed mid-eulogy? You think of your sons. Strong, dangerous, and terrifyingly ambitious. You raised a generation of men who will either conquer the world or turn family dinners into blood feuds. Either way, they'll remember you. Probably while arguing about who you loved more. You didn't. You were equally afraid of all of them. You remember Lagertha, the shield maiden who once threw an axe at your head and somehow made it romantic. You remember Aslaug and her prophecies, and how her sons never quite blinked like normal children. You remember a lot of women, honestly. You were busy, but most of all you remember the sea, the rush of wind in your beard, the roar of oars on water, the way your heart used to beat faster just at the thought of new shores to burn. You smile. You don't regret much, maybe that one snail. Then, like all good Norsemen, you shake off the sentimentality. Reflection is for kings with pensions. You're Ragnar. Your story isn't told in soft voices around the hearth. It's roared across mead halls by drunk men with bad memories. Still, it's a nice thought, that long after your bones are dust and your sons are arguing over your axe collection, someone somewhere will whisper your name, and then add, "Wait, wasn't he the one who got dropped into a snake pit?" Yes. Yes, he was. but we'll get to that soon. Let's face it, when your hobbies include raiding kingdoms, mocking royalty, and pretending to be dead for dramatic effect, it's only a matter of time before someone gets tired of your nonsense. That someone turns out to be King Ella of Northumbria, the human equivalent of a grudge carved into a stone wall. You've insulted him, humiliated him, and possibly borrowed a few of his coastal villages without returning them. He's not thrilled. Eventually, you do the one thing that all aging Viking rock stars eventually do. You go on one last voyage. Except this time, instead of bloodthirsty sons or half-naked warriors, you bring basically nobody. You show up in England with a handful of ships and the swagger of a man who believes his own saga. This is either incredibly brave or deeply stupid. Possibly both. Ella, seizing the moment like a cat spotting a drunken mouse, captures you. Now you're Ragnar Lothbrok, legend, terror of Christendom, conqueror of Paris, in chains. You'd be embarrassed if it weren't all so poetic. You're tossed in a dungeon, fed gruel probably flavoured with resentment, and told that your execution is being scheduled, which is never a comforting phrase. You reflect, briefly, on whether maybe this was inevitable. Enemies stack up when you live like you do. Kings, monks, jealous husbands, abandoned allies, betrayed merchants, exes. Your inbox would be a war crime if it existed. Ella doesn't just want to kill you. He wants a statement. And what better way to say please never invade us again than by tossing the most famous Viking into a pit of vipers? Charming. You're marched out in chains, your beard suitably windswept, your dignity barely hanging on. A crowd gathers, some to cheer, some to gloat, a few just to see if the snake pit rumour was true. Spoiler, it is. You're Ragnar Lothbrok, son of Odin, according to questionable sources, and now you're snakebait. Because of course you are. This is what happens when you annoy too many people for too long. You take one final breath, and, in true Ragnar fashion, you smile. So, there you are. Ragnar Lothbrok, former scourge of Europe, reduced to a man in a pit full of snakes. Not exactly the Viking retirement plan you envisioned, but on the plus side, you've always had a flair for the dramatic. Ella of Northumbria stands above the pit, feeling smug. The crowd murmurs, unsure whether they're witnessing justice or a prelude to a thunderstorm. You, however, feel weirdly at peace. Maybe it's the venom kicking in. Maybe it's knowing this is not the end. Just a rebrand. Because here's the secret. You're about to become more powerful than you ever were alive. As snakes coil around you like awkward bitey scarves, you laugh, loudly. You quote Old Norse poetry. You rant about Odin waiting for you in Valhalla. You start prophesying the violent vengeance of your sons like you're auditioning for the Norse version of Shakespeare. The crowd? Rattled. Ella? Second-guessing. The snakes? Still doing their job. And then you die. Kind of. Because as soon as your corpse cools, your legend heats up. Word spreads like wildfire soaked in mead. Ragnar didn't die. He ascended. Ragnar didn't fall in battle. He chose to die. The snake pit? A metaphor. Or a weird spa treatment. Depends on the bard. In death, you become immortal. Skalds sing of your bravery. Your sons become global PR agents for vengeance. Bjorn, Ivar, Sigurd and the rest go full Avengers Norse edition, tearing through kingdoms while shouting about how you were wronged. Suddenly, everyone wants to be related to Ragnar. Even distant cousins with zero axe skills start name-dropping you at parties. You've transcended mere existence. You're a cautionary tale, a bedtime story, a war cry, and a tattoo inspiration. You've joined that elite club of historical figures whose deaths are more famous than their lives. And let's be honest, if you had to go, a snake pit while shouting poetry isn't the worst way. So no, Ragnar Lothbrok didn't really die in that pit. He became a myth. And as any Viking will tell you, myths last longer than kings. The minute news of your snake pit demise slithers back across the North Sea. Your sons react exactly how you'd expect Viking offspring to react, with uncontrolled, theatrical rage. Bjorn Ironside? He immediately stops polishing his abs and starts sharpening his axe. Ivar the Boneless? His eyes light up like someone just handed him a personalized blood feud. Hvitserk, Sigurd, and the rest? They fall somewhere between vengeful warlord and traumatized Viking middle child. But instead of sitting down and talking about their feelings, which, let's be honest, would never happen, they do the next best thing. Assemble a fleet the size of a biblical flood and sail back to England for a good old-fashioned apocalypse. You see, your death wasn't just personal. It was marketing. You, Ragnar, have become the Norse equivalent of Obi-Wan Kenobi, struck down only to become more powerful in myth than you ever were in flesh. Your sons don't just want revenge, they want to avenge your legend. And so begins what future historians will call the Great Heathen Army, and what Ella will call Oh No. They descend upon England with the subtlety of a dropped longship. Villages burn, Saxons panic. Kings hold emergency prayer meetings. Ella himself is captured in a delightful twist of poetic symmetry. Then comes the part you'd love most. They don't just kill him. No. They give him the blood eagle, that charming Viking chestnut involving ribs, lungs, and more screaming than a medieval dentist's office. Whether this ritual actually happened or is just Nordic PR is up for debate. But it feels Ragnar-y. After that, chaos. Your sons begin carving out kingdoms, fighting over land, loyalty, and who Dad loved more. Ivar becomes a terrifying legend in his own right. Brilliant, brutal, and entirely unbothered by the laws of spine or sanity. Bjorn explores, conquers, and flirts with being king of everything. Hvitserk broods. Sigurd glares. Ubbe tries to be reasonable. Never works. It's a full-blown saga, complete with betrayal, family drama, and questionable hairstyles. Basically, if HBO had existed, your estate would be swimming in royalties. You may be dead, Ragnar, but your drama lives on. You're dead, officially. But honestly, that's just when the real work begins. Because now, you're no longer a man. You're an idea, a vibe, a legend wrapped in fur, dipped in blood, and set to a brooding soundtrack. Bards across Scandinavia are in full creative overdrive. Suddenly, everyone has a Ragnar story. Did you fight a dragon? Possibly. Did you sire 47 children, including half-wolves and berserker demigods? Debatable. But who's going to stop them? History, as it turns out, is remarkably flexible when the subject is too dead to argue. Some tales say you were the son of a king. Others, a farmer with main character energy. Your wives multiply with each retelling. One's a shield maiden, one's a witch, and one's suspiciously good at prophesying doom. There are snake pits, sure, but also sieges, secret islands, golden chains, and a bizarre obsession with trousers. Yes. The Lothbrok part, that's hairy breeches. Because apparently, the man who terrified Europe also had a signature pants aesthetic made from animal skins. You can't make this up. Except, of course, everyone does. Your story becomes a tool for morale, for war, for national identity. Viking leaders claim your bloodline like it's a loyalty badge. Christian chroniclers reluctantly admit you were impressive, if deeply problematic. Even French scribes begrudgingly call you persistent. Centuries later, scholars can't agree on whether you were real, a mashup of 3 or 4 different Vikings, or an early example of historical fan fiction gone rogue. But it doesn't matter. You live on, in sagas whispered around hearths, in terrified prayers muttered by monks, in tourist shops selling horned helmets you never actually wore, and eventually, in a television series where you're suspiciously good-looking and always seem to have perfect lighting. You've achieved what few ever do. You've become bigger than yourself, a symbol of Norse fury, fatalism, and fantastic beard care. And sure, Maybe you never conquered all of Europe. Maybe some of your victories were exaggerated and some of your defeats politely forgotten. But no one remembers that part. They remember Ragnar, the man, the myth, the walking spoiler alert. In the Victorian world, mourning was never simply about sadness. It was a system, an economy, and in many ways, a social obligation. The death of a loved one did not end with burial. Instead, it triggered a cascade of rituals, purchases, and performances that could last years. Entire industries thrived on grief, and mourning itself became one of the most visible expressions of social respectability. Specialized shops appeared in cities like London, selling nothing but mourning attire. Drapers stocked endless bolts of black crepe, bombazine and silk, while jewelers crafted brooches and rings that incorporated symbols of grief. Weeping willows, urns, angels, and locks of hair. Even stationers profited, printing black-bordered writing paper for letters of condolence. Undertakers, once seen as simple tradesmen, rebranded themselves as professionals who orchestrated the full spectacle of funerals, from hearse decorations to the hiring of pallbearers and even mutes, men dressed in solemn black, whose only duty was to look appropriately mournful as they walked beside the coffin. The rules surrounding mourning were not vague suggestions. They were codified in etiquette manuals and enforced by social scrutiny. A wealthy widow was expected to remain in deep mourning for at least 2 years, her clothing layered in heavy black fabric, her social life reduced to near invisibility. Families who failed to follow these expectations risked whispers of disrespect or even moral failing. Mourning became not just a personal expression of grief, but a public performance of virtue, devotion, and class. This intense codification created what might be called the mourning economy. Factories produced endless yards of black textiles. Newspapers filled their pages with advertisements for undertakers' services, mourning jewellery, and even corsets specially designed to be worn under black gowns. For the middle classes, already anxious to prove their refinement, participating fully in mourning rituals was a way of climbing the social ladder. Even the poor stretched their meagre incomes to afford proper funerals, fearing the shame of appearing careless with the memory of the dead. In short, mourning in Victorian Britain was not an isolated moment of sorrow. It was a ritualized way of life, one that transformed personal loss into a carefully staged social drama. Grief became visible, regulated, and profitable, and no household could escape its reach. Clothing was the most visible marker of grief in the Victorian age, and it was impossible to escape its rules. To step into public without the proper mourning attire was to risk scandal, humiliation, or even the loss of one's social standing. Mourning dress acted as a uniform of sorrow, broadcasting to the world not only that someone had died, but also how closely the mourner had been related to the deceased, and how much time had passed since the death. The body might be buried in a matter of days, but the wardrobe carried grief for years. For widows, the expectations were particularly severe. In the first stage, known as deep mourning, they were required to wear matte black garments made of crepe or bombazine, fabrics chosen specifically for their dull, lifeless finish. Jewellery was forbidden, save for pieces of jet or memorial items incorporating the hair of the deceased. Veils of black crepe or silk, sometimes covering the face down to the waist, were mandatory when appearing in public. This stage lasted at least a full year, often 2, during which time the widow was expected to live almost like a shadow of herself, moving silently through the world in perpetual black. Gradually, the rules allowed for transition into half mourning. This stage introduced softer shades, greys, lilacs, and mauves, that signalled grief was easing, but not forgotten. Jewellery could return in moderation, often in the form of lockets or brooches bearing the loved one's image or hair. It was in this stage that society began to re-accept the mourner, offering invitations and visits once more. Men, by contrast, bore a far lighter burden. A black suit, a cravat, or even just a black armband could suffice. Their mourning was less about fashion and more about symbolic acknowledgement. Children, too, had their own codes. Little girls might wear white dresses trimmed with black ribbons, while boys dressed in dark coats. The sheer complexity of these rules gave rise to an entire industry of mourning dressmakers who specialized in outfitting families at short notice. Some families even rented mourning clothes, unable to afford the expense of custom garments. Etiquette books published strict timelines for how long one must remain in each stage of mourning, depending on the relationship: widow, child, parent, sibling, or even a distant cousin. In Victorian society, grief was stitched into the very fabric of daily life. Every hemline, veil, and ribbon carried meaning, turning sorrow into a visible code that could be read by anyone who passed you on the street. In the Victorian imagination, hair was more than a strand of keratin. It was a relic of permanence. Skin decayed, bones crumbled, but hair remained unchanged for centuries. This quality made it the ideal vessel for remembrance, and so it became the centerpiece of a uniquely intimate mourning practice, the crafting of jewelry and keepsakes from the hair of the dead. A lock of hair could be woven into intricate patterns, braided like fine thread, or even ground into pigment to tint a miniature portrait. Jewelers in London and Paris became masters of the art, offering catalogues of rings, brooches, bracelets, and lockets specifically designed for memorial purposes. Families might bring the hair of a deceased child or spouse to these artisans, who would fashion it into sentimental treasures. Some were simple, a locket containing a curl of hair tied with silk. Others were astonishingly complex, entire wreaths made of twisted hair flowers encased under glass domes, or bracelets woven entirely from the strands of the departed. Contrary to modern sensibilities, Victorians did not find this macabre. To them, it was tender. Wearing a ring containing a lock of a mother's hair was a way of keeping her physically close. Parents mourning children often commissioned elaborate hairwork wreaths, arranging strands from multiple siblings in floral patterns. These keepsakes, proudly displayed in parlours, acted as both memorial and conversation piece. The practice was not confined to the wealthy. Printed instruction manuals taught women how to craft hair jewellery at home, a skill as common as embroidery. Middle-class families unable to afford a jeweller could still honour their loved ones with handcrafted tokens. Of course, the market expanded beyond mourning. Hair jewellery was also exchanged among lovers as symbols of devotion, but its strongest cultural power lay in memorialisation. Queen Victoria herself helped popularise the trend when she commissioned jewellery made from the hair of her beloved Prince Albert after his death. Her example filtered through society, lending royal legitimacy to a practice already steeped in sentimentality. These objects remind us that Victorian mourning was not only public, but deeply personal. While veils and dress codes announced grief to society, hair jewellery allowed mourners to carry the dead privately, against their skin, woven into the very fabric of daily life. To the Victorians, a lock of hair was not grim, it was eternal. The Victorian era was obsessed with memory, and no innovation captured this more vividly than post-mortem photography. In an age when few families owned painted portraits and photography itself was still expensive, the death of a loved one often became the moment when a photograph was finally taken. These images were not morbid curiosities, they were sacred relics, often the only lasting visual record of a person's existence. Photographers specializing in mourning portraits traveled to homes soon after death, carrying heavy equipment to set up cameras beside the deceased. Infants and young children were the most common subjects, since childhood mortality remained heartbreakingly high. Adults were also photographed, often posed in chairs or beds, their clothing carefully arranged, their faces brushed with powder to soften the pallor. To the modern eye, these photographs may appear eerie, but to Victorian families, they were acts of love. Techniques varied. Some photographers posed the dead in lifelike positions, propping them with hidden stands or seating them beside siblings. Eyes might be painted open on the photograph afterward, creating an unsettling illusion of alertness. Others preferred more peaceful compositions. The child lying on a pillow, holding flowers, or the adult surrounded by symbols of faith like crucifixes and Bibles. In every case, the goal was not to emphasize death, but to capture a final semblance of life. These photographs were treasured and displayed prominently in parlours or kept in albums alongside portraits of the living. They were sometimes inscribed with the person's name, age, and date of death, turning them into both image and epitaph. Families would look at them not with discomfort but with reverence, often using them as focal points for remembrance during anniversaries or gatherings. Post-mortem photography also reflected the democratization of memory. Whereas painted portraits had been the privilege of the wealthy, photography made commemoration accessible to the middle classes. Even modest families might save to afford a single mourning photograph, ensuring their loved one was never forgotten. The practice faded by the early 20th century, as death gradually retreated from the household to hospitals, and mourning customs became less rigid. Yet in the Victorian world, post-mortem photography was not a strange curiosity. It was the ultimate merging of technology and sentiment. For families who had so little time with their children or spouses, one frozen image was enough to make memory eternal. In the Victorian age, funerals were not merely solemn farewells. They were spectacles, choreographed displays of grief that blended ritual, performance, and social commentary. To bury a loved one was to stage a public event, and the scale of that event spoke volumes about the family's status, wealth, and piety. Death was a stage, and the funeral was its grand performance. The centerpiece was the hearse itself. Wealthy families commissioned magnificent horse-drawn carriages painted black and adorned with elaborate plumes of ostrich feathers. The horses, too, were draped in black trappings, with attendants walking beside them in sombre livery. The longer the procession, the grander the display of mourning. For poorer families, the contrast was stark. Many went into debt just to hire a modest hearse or coffin, unwilling to risk the shame of appearing careless with the dead. Professional mourners, known as mutes, were another key part of the pageantry. These men were hired to walk silently beside the coffin, their solemn presence signalling the weight of grief. Their role was not to express emotion, but to embody it, to make grief visible, even if the family's own sorrow was private or restrained. In many ways, they functioned as living symbols of mourning etiquette. Inside churches and chapels, funerals became further stages for performance. Flowers were arranged not only for beauty but for symbolism, lilies for purity, ivy for eternal life, and evergreens for the promise of resurrection. Clergy delivered eulogies that blended comfort with moral instruction, reminding the living of their duty to prepare for death. The coffin itself was often lined in silk, adorned with brass fittings, and engraved with verses of scripture or poetry. For the Victorians, attending a funeral was a communal obligation. Neighbours, colleagues, and acquaintances turned out not only to honour the deceased, but also to participate in the social ritual. Attendance was a visible sign of respect, and absence could spark whispers of disrespect or feud. Funerals thus reinforced networks of community and class, reminding everyone of their place in the social order. In the end, Victorian funerals reveal how grief was turned outward, made visible and theatrical. What modern eyes might see as extravagant or excessive was, for them, a way to transform death into something structured, meaningful, and above all, public. It was not enough to mourn quietly. Mourning had to be seen. In the Victorian world, death did not spare the young, and neither did mourning customs. Children, though innocent, were expected to participate in the elaborate codes of grief that defined society. The mortality rate in the 19th century was staggeringly high. Diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, and tuberculosis cut through households with devastating speed. It was not unusual for parents to bury multiple children, and mourning customs reflected the constant presence of loss within the family. Children were dressed according to their age and sex. Little girls were often clothed in white dresses, the colour of innocence, trimmed with black ribbons or sashes. White symbolised purity and angelic transition, but the black trimming reminded all who saw them that they carried the burden of grief. Boys typically wore dark suits or jackets, simplified versions of adult mourning wear. The point was not comfort, but conformity. Even the smallest child became a public emblem of loss, their clothing signalling grief just as strongly as an adult's crepe veil. But children were not just passive participants, they were also the focus of some of the era's most poignant mourning rituals. Families often commissioned post-mortem portraits of deceased children, sometimes posing siblings beside the lifeless body in a strange fusion of the living and the dead. Locks of hair from children were preserved in jewellery, woven into wreaths, or tucked into lockets. Parents often created small shrines in the home, complete with photographs, flowers, and relics, ensuring that the memory of the child remained physically present in daily life. Beyond clothing and relics, extended mourning rituals dictated how long grief should last. Etiquette books outlined precise durations. Parents might mourn a child for up to a year, siblings for 6 months. Anniversaries of death were solemnly observed, with families gathering to visit graves, send memorial cards, or hold small services. Some families left an empty chair at the dinner table, a daily reminder of absence. The weight of these rituals was heavy, but they also gave structure to unbearable loss. In a world where disease and death struck unpredictably, ritual provided order. For children, participation in mourning was both a duty and a lesson. It taught them early that death was not hidden away, but acknowledged, woven into the rhythm of life itself. Victorian childhood, then, was shadowed not only by the risk of early death, but by the certainty that mourning would follow. To grow up in that world was to learn grief as naturally as play. Victorian mourning was not merely about loss, it was a code of conduct, one that reinforced the values and hierarchies of the time. Nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of gender. The rules for men and women were not equal. They reflected broader Victorian ideals about duty, morality, and the place of each sex within society. For widows, mourning was nearly a prison sentence. Etiquette manuals dictated that a woman should remain in deep mourning for at least 2 years after her husband's death. During this time, she was to wear heavy black crepe gowns, avoid social gatherings, and live a life of quiet seclusion. Even after those 2 years, she might enter half mourning, introducing muted shades like grey, lavender, or lilac, but still signalling that her life was defined by absence. A widow's sorrow was expected to be all-consuming, her devotion measured by how long she withdrew from society. Some women, like Queen Victoria herself, wore mourning black for the rest of their lives, turning personal grief into permanent identity. Men, however, faced far lighter expectations. A widower might don a black armband or wear dark suits for a few months, but there was no demand for years of seclusion. In fact, society often encouraged widowers to remarry quickly, especially if children were involved. While women were expected to embody eternal loyalty, men were permitted, and even praised, for moving on. The double standard was stark, but it reflected the deeply patriarchal world of Victorian England, where female virtue was tied to submission and sacrifice. Beyond widowhood, other relationships carried specific rules. Children were to mourn parents for a full year, siblings for 6 months, and cousins for a few weeks. Every bond had its prescribed timeline, and failing to follow it could lead to whispered accusations of disrespect. Women, again, bore the heavier load. Their fashion, movements, and even conversation were policed for signs of impropriety during mourning. A woman who appeared too lively, too soon, risked social ruin. These rules, though rigid, served a purpose. They turned grief into a shared language, recognizable to everyone. Black veils, jet jewelry, and pale lilac gowns acted as silent messages, signaling devotion, virtue, and piety. But they also reinforced inequality. Women's grief was expected to be public and prolonged, while men's was brief and private. Mourning, then, was not just about death. It was a stage where gender roles were performed, enforced, and displayed. To walk through a Victorian cemetery was to step into a forest of symbols. Death was not only acknowledged, it was monumentalized in stone, iron, and carefully chosen imagery. Gravestones, mausoleums, and monuments were covered with motifs that spoke a language the Victorians knew well, each symbol carrying messages of faith, love, or sorrow. The most common figures were angels. Carved with outstretched wings and raised fingers pointing heavenward, they guided the soul toward salvation. Some stood solemn with downcast eyes, while others wept openly, draped across urns or gravestones. Broken columns symbolized lives cut short, particularly those of young people. Draped urns suggested the body's mortality, while evergreen wreaths conveyed eternal life. Even the humble clasped hands carved on headstones told a story. Sometimes they represented the bond between husband and wife, other times the parting of the living and the dead, with one hand pulling upward toward heaven. Cemeteries themselves were carefully designed landscapes. In an era of rapid industrialization and crowded cities, the garden cemetery movement transformed burial grounds into places of beauty. Winding paths, ornamental trees, and elaborate sculptures made cemeteries resemble parks, encouraging families to stroll among the graves on Sundays. These spaces blurred the line between mourning and leisure. Picnics, walks, and even courting couples could be found among the monuments. For Victorians, communing with the dead was part of daily life. Memorials within the home echoed this symbolic richness. Families kept mourning cards decorated with black borders and biblical verses. Miniature glass domes enclosed hairwork wreaths or preserved flowers from the funeral. Portraits of the deceased were framed with symbols of eternity, ivy, doves, or laurel. Every object reinforced the idea that death, though painful, was not an ending but a passage. Even epitaphs became vehicles of meaning. Gravestones carried verses that blended religious hope with sentimentality. Gone but not forgotten, asleep in Jesus, or personalized lines of poetry. The Victorian belief in the afterlife was not abstract. It was carved in stone, worn on the body, and planted in gardens of remembrance. These layers of symbolism reveal how deeply Victorians sought to domesticate death, making it comprehensible through metaphor. In a society where mortality was omnipresent, symbols offered comfort. They transformed cemeteries into places where grief could be both expressed and softened, where every statue and carving whispered, "Life ends, but memory endures." By the late 19th century, mourning in Britain had evolved into something so elaborate that critics began to mock it as excessive. What had once been a set of customs for expressing grief had become in many ways a performance, an art form where sorrow was staged, displayed, and measured by the public eye. Death, in Victorian society, was not hidden behind closed doors. It was paraded in the streets, stitched into clothing, carved into stone, and captured in photographs. It was a spectacle. Funerals themselves became theatrical productions. The grander the procession, the greater the family's display of respectability. The size of the hearse, the number of carriages following behind, the plume of feathers atop the horses, all communicated wealth and status as much as devotion. For the poor, this expectation could be crushing. Many families went into debt to host respectable funerals, knowing that a modest or unattended burial would brand them as careless or dishonourable. Death was not just an emotional burden, but a financial one. Queen Victoria set the tone. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she withdrew into a life of perpetual mourning, wearing black until her own death 4 decades later. Her example elevated mourning into a near-sacred duty, and society followed suit. Her devotion became the model for widows across Britain, reinforcing the idea that true love was measured in lifelong grief. But what began as sincerity in the royal household trickled down into rigid expectations for everyone else. Critics of the time saw this theatricality as excessive. Newspapers occasionally lampooned the endless veils, the black-draped parlours, the morbid fascination with death photography. Yet for most Victorians, these customs offered comfort and order. In an age when epidemics and industrial accidents claimed lives unpredictably, ritual gave shape to chaos. Mourning made death visible but also manageable. What lingers today is not just the image of black veils and jet jewellery, but the sheer intensity with which Victorians confronted mortality. Where modern culture often hides death away, Victorians insisted on engaging with it, wrapping grief in fabric, symbols, and ceremony. To them, mourning was not an interruption of life. It was woven into life itself. The spectacle of death was, paradoxically, a way to keep the dead present, a way to insist that memory outlasts mortality. In Tudor England, the banquet was more than a gathering for food. It was a calculated display of dominance. Monarchs and nobles did not simply dine. They staged productions where every roasted bird, every glittering goblet, and every sugared sculpture proclaimed wealth and authority. A feast was political theatre, and the audience was everyone who mattered, ambassadors, courtiers, and rivals whose loyalty or envy could shift the balance of power. For Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, feasts were weapons in their arsenal of rule. A hall set with groaning tables announced prosperity, even when the treasury ran thin. To serve dishes of abundance, layered courses that stretched into the dozens, was to assure guests that the crown had access to limitless resources. More than that, it was a message. If this much food could be spared for a single evening, imagine the reserves behind it. Guests were not meant to leave comfortably full. They were meant to be overwhelmed. The scale of Tudor banquets defied reason. Entire roasted boars were presented alongside peacocks redressed in their feathers, swans gilded in gold leaf, and pies that burst open to release live birds in a show of culinary theatre. The very excess was the point. Eating until one could not move was less important than witnessing the host's ability to summon such wonders from kitchen and countryside alike. But feasts also functioned as stages of hierarchy. Seating arrangements were meticulously planned, with the monarch or noble seated beneath a canopy, their elevated dais a reminder of divine status. The closer one sat to the centre of power, the greater the honour. Those relegated to the far edges of the hall understood the message. Banquets were as much about reminding people of their place as they were about feeding them. Beyond England's borders, banquets impressed foreign emissaries. A lavish spread of imported spices, Mediterranean wines and sugar confections told ambassadors that England was not a provincial kingdom, but a player in the global trade networks of Europe and beyond. Every feast was diplomacy made edible. Thus, a Tudor banquet was never just a dinner. It was spectacle, statement, and stagecraft rolled into one. The food dazzled, but the message was clear. Here was power, visible and consumable, served on silver platters for all to admire. At the heart of Tudor banquets lay the royal table, a physical and symbolic centerpiece of power. To dine in the same hall as the king or queen was a privilege. To share their table was an honour reserved for the few. The royal dais, raised above the rest of the hall, was not just about visibility. It was a throne in miniature, reminding everyone that sovereignty extended even into the rituals of eating and drinking. The table itself was dressed as magnificently as the monarch. Linen cloths were imported from Flanders, goblets of silver and gilt reflected candlelight, and great salt cellars, massive vessels often shaped like ships or castles, stood as symbols of rank. In fact, placement relative to the salt cellar was a subtle code. The highborn sat above the salt, closer to the monarch, while lesser guests found themselves below the salt, reminded of their lower standing even as they ate. The foods chosen for the royal table were not random. Dishes were carefully selected for symbolism. Venison from the royal forests spoke of privilege, for only the crown could grant hunting rights. Exotic fruits like oranges and pomegranates hinted at England's growing ties to Mediterranean trade. Imported spices, cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, signalled both wealth and access to global commerce. Even sugar, still a luxury in Tudor England, was lavished on elaborate sculptures called subtleties, edible works of art that doubled as political propaganda. These might depict castles, coats of arms, or even allegorical scenes meant to flatter the monarch or reinforce dynastic claims. But the royal table was not only about magnificence, it was also about control. The monarch's dining habits were highly ritualized. Servants performed elaborate ceremonies of hand-washing, wine-pouring, and dish-tasting. Each gesture reinforced hierarchy. The monarch did not touch food until it was presented, uncovered, and declared safe. Guests observed this choreography with awe, understanding that the act of eating was as carefully managed as any court ceremony. For foreign ambassadors, the spectacle of the royal table was diplomacy at its most tangible. Here was England's ruler, seated above shimmering dishes, surrounded by abundance and ritual. Every bite taken was meant to convey stability, strength, and divine favour. To eat at the royal table was to participate in a performance of monarchy itself. The food was sustenance, but the ceremony was power, reminding all who watched that even the simplest act, lifting a cup, could become a symbol of rule. If the royal table was the throne of dining, the food served upon it was theatre in edible form. Tudor cooks, often trained in grand households or abroad, were less concerned with flavour than with spectacle. A dish was meant to astonish before it ever touched the lips. Banquets became stages, and food became the actors. Exotic dishes were prized not simply for their taste, but for what they represented: access, wealth, and power. A roasted swan, its feathers carefully reapplied after cooking, was a dramatic centerpiece that declared the household's dominion over nature itself. Peacocks were treated in the same way: cooked, then redressed in their dazzling plumage, heads reattached, and sometimes their beaks made to spit fire through clever use of alcohol-soaked wicks. Boars' heads, stuffed with spices and fruits, were presented with gilded tusks. These dishes were less about nourishment than about eliciting gasps of wonder. Equally important was the presence of sugar. In Tudor England, sugar was a rare and expensive commodity, shipped from overseas plantations. To display it in abundance was to flaunt both wealth and international connections. Confectioners crafted subtleties, delicate sculptures of sugar paste moulded into castles, mythological figures, saints, or allegories of Tudor power. These creations often carried political messages. A sugar fortress might symbolize England's strength. A sugar Tudor rose, dynastic legitimacy. Guests devoured not just sweets, but symbols of propaganda. Spices played their part in the drama. Cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and cloves were used lavishly, not for subtle seasoning, but for extravagance. A heavily spiced dish told guests that the host could afford what most households might only smell at market stalls. Even common meats and fish were elevated by drowning them in exotic flavours. Theatrical touches extended beyond the food itself. Pies were sometimes baked with live birds inside, so that when the crust was cut, a flurry of sparrows or doves would erupt from the dish, to the amazement of diners. Coloured jellies, layered in bright reds and greens, trembled in candlelight like jewels. Nothing was too impractical if it could dazzle. These spectacles were not just indulgence, they were messages. To present exotic dishes was to show mastery over trade, nature, and artistry. In a world where most people dined on bread, ale, and pottage, the banquet hall became a realm of fantasy, where food transformed into theatre, and eating became an act of awe. If meat was the muscle of Tudor banquets, sugar was the soul. In the 16th century, sugar was still considered a rare luxury, imported at great expense from overseas. To modernise, it might seem ordinary, but to the Tudors, it was a glittering symbol of wealth and refinement. To display sugar in abundance was to demonstrate that one's purse was deep, one's connections far-reaching, and one's sophistication unquestioned. Confectioners, highly skilled artisans in noble households, transformed sugar into marvels of edible art. These creations, known as subtleties, were anything but subtle. They took the form of miniature castles, saints, heraldic beasts, ships, and allegorical scenes, all painstakingly moulded from sugar paste. Painted with bright dyes or even covered with gold leaf, they dazzled guests with their artistry before ever being tasted. The sculptures often carried political messages. A sugar Tudor rose might proclaim dynastic stability, while a sugar crown reminded diners of the legitimacy of royal power. Every banquet was also a stage for propaganda, and sugar was the medium. Sugar was also used in medicines and as a symbol of health. Sweetened syrups and lozenges were offered at the end of meals, believed to aid digestion and ward off disease. To consume sugar was not just indulgence, it was a performance of wellness and privilege. Ordinary people rarely tasted it. In their world, honey remained the sweetener of choice. For courtiers and nobles, however, sugar became almost addictive, shaping an entire culture of sweetmeats, candied fruits, and preserved flowers. Perhaps the most striking use of sugar was in the creation of banqueting houses, small, separate rooms, or garden pavilions, where dessert was served in a display of elegance and intimacy. Here, tables groaned under platters of marchpane, marzipan, comfits, candied citrus peel, and wafers. Guests moved from the great hall into these spaces for a second act of the feast, one that was lighter but no less political. The sugar banquet was where alliances were whispered, marriages hinted at, and diplomacy sweetened. The heavy reliance on sugar also left its mark on Tudor health. By the late 16th century, tooth decay became so common among the wealthy that blackened teeth were almost a status symbol, proof of one's ability to indulge. Elizabeth I herself was said to have a sweet tooth, favouring candied violets and marchpane. Her smile, darkened by decay, became a strange badge of royal luxury. In Tudor feasting, sugar was not just food. It was spectacle, medicine, politics, and indulgence wrapped into crystalline perfection. Tudor banquets were not only about eating, they were immersive performances where music, spectacle, and pageantry carried as much weight as the food itself. To sit at a great feast was to be enveloped in a world where every sense was engaged. Sight, sound, taste, and even smell. Entertainment was carefully chosen to reinforce the grandeur of the host and to ensure that the banquet lingered in the memory of every guest. Music was the constant heartbeat of the Tudor feast. Minstrels and consorts of viols, lutes, and shawms played as courses were brought in, filling the hall with harmonies that reminded guests of courtly sophistication. Trumpeters announced the arrival of each new dish, turning even roasted meat into a royal procession. The combination of sound and sight transformed dining into theatre. Diners were not simply eating, they were participating in a choreographed event. Masks and pageants added another layer of drama. Costumed performers emerged between courses, enacting allegories or mythological scenes that flattered the monarch or celebrated dynastic triumphs. A masque might feature gods and goddesses descending to honour the king, or actors dressed as virtues and vices in a moral play that reinforced Tudor authority. These performances were as political as they were entertaining, reminding guests that even leisure was bound to power. Jesters also played their role, offering comic relief amid the pomp. Their jibes, though sometimes sharp, were tolerated because they provided a sanctioned outlet for humour in otherwise rigid settings. Jugglers, acrobats, and even animal trainers might appear, dazzling guests between heavy courses. The goal was variety. Banquets lasted hours, sometimes entire days, and entertainment kept spirits high while guests digested. The visual environment itself was part of the show. Banquet halls were lit with hundreds of candles and torches, casting golden light across polished silver and gilded dishes. Tapestries depicting battles or biblical scenes hung from the walls, reminding guests of the host's lineage and piety. Even the servants, clad in livery, moved in carefully rehearsed patterns, their service a performance of discipline and wealth. For ambassadors and visiting nobles, the entertainment was more than diversion. It was a statement. A host who could summon musicians, actors, and spectacles on command demonstrated not only wealth, but control over culture itself. To feed the body was impressive, but to command art was sublime. Thus, Tudor banquets fused food and entertainment into a single act of theatre, leaving no guest in doubt. They had witnessed magnificence, orchestrated down to the last note. No Tudor banquet was random in its layout. The seating plan itself was a map of power, a visible chart of who mattered and who did not. Where one sat, and beside whom, was as important as what one ate. In fact, for many guests, the true feast was not on the plate, but in the subtle politics of proximity to the host. At the centre of it all sat the monarch or noble, elevated on a raised dais under a canopy of state. This was not mere decoration, it was architectural hierarchy. The elevation reminded every eye in the hall that the ruler was literally and symbolically above the rest. Their table was laid with the finest cloths and the grandest salt cellars, often shaped like castles or ships. To dine at this table, or even near it, was to bask in reflected authority. The closer one sat to the monarch, the greater the honour. Those above the salt, seated between the monarch and the great salt cellar, were individuals of high status or royal favour. They enjoyed not only finer cuts of meat, but also the prestige of visibility. Those below the salt sat farther away, still well fed, but reminded of their lower station. Even at a feast of excess, not all portions of honour were equal. Every detail reinforced order. Courtiers competed fiercely for placement, knowing that to be seated near the sovereign could mean influence, advancement, or favour. To be pushed to the margins was a warning. One star at court was dimming. Ambassadors carefully noted their positions compared to rivals, reading the seating as a diplomatic barometer of England's priorities. A chair could speak louder than a treaty. The hall itself emphasised this hierarchy. Servants moved in careful procession, bringing dishes first to the monarch's table before distributing them to others. Guests observed the ritual, understanding that food travelled down the chain of command just as authority did. Even gestures like hand-washing and wine-pouring were tiered, lavishly attended at the high table, sparsely at the far ends. For commoners who never glimpsed such feasts, accounts of seating arrangements reinforced the idea of a world rigidly ordered, where one's place at table mirrored one's place in life. The Tudor banquet, then, was not simply hospitality. It was a living diagram of power, one that reminded every guest that food, like favour, flowed from the top down. Tudor banquets were never just about indulgence. They were stages for diplomacy, where every dish and every gesture carried political weight. In an age when treaties were sealed as much with toasts as with ink, the banquet hall was a battleground of etiquette, abundance, and spectacle. A feast could charm allies, unsettle rivals, and project England's image as a kingdom of both wealth and stability. Foreign ambassadors who attended Tudor banquets were treated to calculated displays of magnificence. The endless succession of courses, swans, venison, sugar subtleties, was more than culinary variety. It was a message. England could afford excess, even in times of scarcity. This was a country whose monarch could command resources at will. To dine at Henry VIII's table, for instance, was to be reminded of his expansive reach, his ability to import spices from the East and wines from France, even while waging costly wars. Banquets also provided informal stages for negotiation. While formal treaties were signed in chambers, relationships were built over food and wine. Ambassadors positioned near the monarch could whisper flattery, hint at proposals, or gauge reactions. The convivial atmosphere, softened by music and spectacle, allowed delicate topics to be broached more smoothly than in council halls. Feasting blurred the line between entertainment and statecraft. Politics also unfolded among domestic elites. Invitations to a banquet were signals of favour. Absence could be read as a deliberate slight. Who was seated near the king or queen was itself a form of messaging. A rival moved further down the table understood their diminishing influence. A newcomer granted a seat near the high table knew their star was rising. The banquet was a theatre of inclusion and exclusion, where one's political fate might be glimpsed in the placement of a chair. Even the choice of food carried symbolic meaning. Serving sturgeon from English rivers, or venison from royal forests, reinforced sovereignty over land and resources. Exotic fruits and spices highlighted international connections. Sugar subtleties often depicted allegories of power, castles, crowns, or mythological figures affirming Tudor supremacy. Every course was propaganda, sweetened, spiced, and served on silver platters. For the Tudors, then, banquets were more than hospitality. They were tools of governance, subtle yet powerful instruments of persuasion. To feed an ambassador was to impress him. To overwhelm him with abundance was to remind him that England, though insular in geography, was vast in ambition. Tudor banquets were not random indulgences. They followed rhythms dictated by both the church calendar and the turning of the seasons. Religion, deeply woven into daily life, shaped not only when people could feast, but what could be eaten. Seasons, in turn, determined what could be harvested, hunted, or preserved for the table. Together, they created a cycle of abundance and restraint that gave Tudor dining its unique character. The Catholic Church imposed strict rules on diet, especially regarding fasting and abstinence. Fridays, Lent, and numerous holy days required the avoidance of meat. Yet even in this restriction, Tudor feasts found opportunity. Hosts turned fasting meals into lavish showcases of fish and seafood, eels, salmon, sturgeon, and even imported delicacies like salted cod from northern waters. Elaborate fish pies and stews replaced roasted boars and venison, reminding guests that magnificence could be achieved even within religious limits. After the English Reformation, many of these traditions persisted, their power less theological than cultural. Fasting days were simply part of the rhythm of life. The seasons dictated availability. Autumn was the season of the hunt, when venison and game birds filled banquet tables. Winter feasts relied on preserved foods, salted meats, dried fruits, and strong ale, paired with imported luxuries to make up for scarcity. Spring brought fresh greens, young lamb, and eggs, symbols of rebirth celebrated in Easter feasts. Summer was the height of abundance. Cherries, strawberries, and peas appeared in tarts and stews, while fresh herbs brightened otherwise heavy dishes. To serve seasonal foods was both practical and symbolic, showing mastery over the natural cycle. Feasts tied closely to the liturgical year became some of the grandest spectacles. Christmas, for example, was marked by the boar's head ceremony, in which a whole roasted boar was paraded into the hall with song and fanfare. Twelfth Night featured revelry, masquerades, and sweetmeats. Easter feasts celebrated renewal with lamb, while harvest festivals honoured plenty with bread, ale, and pies brimming with autumn produce. Each religious occasion became an opportunity for display, reinforcing both piety and prosperity. What emerges is a portrait of banquets as mirrors of the divine and the natural. To feast was to honour God's bounty, and to demonstrate one's ability to harness it. Even the most extravagant Tudor banquets were anchored in this balance, abundance tempered by religious observance, magnificence shaped by the cycle of the seasons. Though the Tudor dynasty ended in the early 17th century, its feasting culture left a long shadow over English dining traditions. What began as political theatre in the great halls of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I echoed into the Stuart courts, the Georgian dining rooms, and even the Victorian fascination with elaborate table settings. The Tudor banquet, in its extravagance and symbolism, became a template for how power could be staged through food. One legacy was the emphasis on display. The Tudor obsession with spectacle, swans redressed in feathers, sugar castles, pies that erupted with live birds, inspired later generations to see dining as performance. Even as culinary tastes shifted toward refinement and subtle flavours in later centuries, the principle remained. Food was not only for nourishment, but for impressing, entertaining, and communicating status. The idea of the showpiece dish owes much to Tudor banquets. Another enduring mark was the centrality of sugar. Tudor confectionery, with its subtleties and sweetmeats, set the stage for England's growing addiction to sugar in the centuries that followed. By the 18th century, tea sweetened with sugar became a national ritual, a habit rooted in the Tudor use of sugar as luxury and symbol. The glittering banquets of the 1500s paved the way for a culture where sweetness became both daily comfort and imperial commodity. Tudor feasting also cemented the link between dining and diplomacy. The idea that a banquet could sway alliances or communicate power continued into later courts. Ambassadors expected to be fed well. Monarchs knew that to scrimp was to risk offence. Even in modern state banquets, where dishes are more restrained, the echoes of Tudor grandeur remain in the careful choreography of courses, seating, and ceremony. Perhaps most lasting, however, was the Tudor belief that food mirrored hierarchy. The arrangement of tables, the division of portions, the ritual of service, all reinforced social order. This culture of rank and privilege persisted long after the Tudors, shaping English dining etiquette for centuries. Even today, the notion of a head table at weddings or banquets recalls the dais of Tudor halls. In the end, Tudor banquets were more than culinary excess. They were cultural scripts that defined how England expressed power, wealth, and identity. Though swans in feathers and sugar castles have vanished from modern tables, the Tudor lesson endures. To feed others is to tell a story about who you are and what you command.